Hi there. This is the last lecture in this little series called Aether and the Shamanic Universe. And in this lecture, I want to try and summarize the ether in such a simple way that we can all get it. Now, if you've watched the entire lecture series, then this will make more sense to you, but it should still make sense regardless. So let's start at the beginning. The ether, what is it? What is it? Let's define the ether. So the ether is totality. Everything in the universe is the ether. And the ether is also inertia, which means rest. So the ether is stillness. It is balance. Everything at rest. Now the entire universe, the totality of everything, is balance. Everything in totality must be balance. And so we can say that is rest. However, inside the universe, within that totality, there is disturbance, imbalance. So within the totality of rest, that is balance, inside that there is imbalance. Imbalance means movement. It means energy. So we can say that the ether is rest. It is balance. It is inertia. But it is also potential energy. Potentiality. So then what is energy? Well, once you have a disturbance of the ether, a divergence of that rest, that balance, now we've got movement. So we can say that energy is a disturbance or a divergence of the ether. However, once we've got this disturbance, what happens? Well, this disturbance wants to go back to rest. So once we have a potential, a divergence or a disturbance of this balance, now we have a movement, and that movement wants to go back to balance. So we can call that entropy. Entropy is the process of returning back to rest, returning back to the ether. Now, it's a bit deeper than that, because the ether in totality must include consciousness. It's the soul, the spirit, as well as the body, material substance. It's everything, spiritual and physical. And they're both the same thing. So in a spiritual sense, the ether is again totality. It is rest. But that means the unconscious mind is totally unconscious. There is no space, no time, no disturbance. Total rest. And here's the thing, total rest means stillness, stationary. It is static. Very important. But within this stationary, static rest, inside it, there is movement, disturbance. That is the universe we experience. And how does this happen? What is the process of this unconscious mind being disturbed? How does this happen? Well, the unconscious mind essentially wakes up. It becomes the conscious mind. Again, this is very abstract philosophy, but it's the only way it can work. We have to try and think like this. The unconscious mind wakes up, and the first thing that the conscious mind does is visualize space. So the ether, as it emerges, becomes space. But the ether is infinite. It's zero, it is rest, but it is also infinity. Infinity is the totality of everything, and that means balance, which means rest. It's the same thing, very deep. But for us in this material world, we are in space. What does that mean for us? Well, it means this unconscious mind outside space and time. It's stationary, it's static. Well, it's everywhere. It's everywhere in space around us. It's everywhere and it's nowhere. Now, the interesting thing is space has no physicality. Space itself is nothing. That is the empty void. There's nothing in space. Space has no physical properties. But we, as consciousness, as a soul, spirit, we can experience space. Space is still an experience of the soul, not physical. And I'm saying that space is also infinite. It's infinite because it's not physical. And consciousness can experience this infinite space. And in fact, consciousness creates this infinite space. And furthermore, this infinite space is filled with consciousness. Consciousness is the unmanifest, the unconscious, coming into manifestation. And it does so through space. But remember, space is not physical. No physical properties. It is still static, stationary. And that is the ether. Or we can say that is the first appearance of the ether. The unconscious mind waking up becomes space. But that is static, stationary, balance. However, within space there is disturbance, there is movement. So let's say this once more. The ether is space. But there is movement within space, and we can call that time. Time is only a measure of movement. So we can say the ether creates space-time. The lightest density of the ether is space-time. And we can also say, we can call that thought energy. Because it is consciousness. Pure consciousness creates space, but it is experiencing space. Once you experience something, that is happening in time. So consciousness creates space-time. It's not quite the same as Einstein. Something slightly different, what I'm saying. Space is static, unmoving, stationary, but time is the movement within that static ether. And it has no physical properties. It is pure consciousness, thought energy. Now here it becomes interesting. Within this static space, we know there is movement. And there's going to be two fundamental movements. And with these two fundamental movements, all movement can be created. You're going to have a clockwise spiral and you're going to have an anti-clockwise spiral. One will be expanding and one will be contracting. Between these two movements, all movements can be created. The ether will also condense in one of these spirals. It will condense inwards, get heavier and heavier. And the ether, that is space-time itself, condenses inwards. Thought energy will condense inwards. When thought energy condenses inwards, it becomes etheric energy. I'm calling this etheric energy. And we can also call that emotional energy. It's still a spiritual thing. And when thought energy, pure spiritual ether, condenses into etheric energy, we have the formation of a soul. A soul is this etheric energy, emotional energy, but that will condense in further due to this spiral movement. It condenses in further from etheric energy into light energy. So this is where it's difficult, and it's very difficult to explain this. I'm just trying to give you the overall picture so you can visualize this. Thought energy condenses, which is space. Space itself condenses into etheric energy. But etheric energy is a denser form of space. And this etheric energy is still moving in space. We've got a slight interaction going on. Background space, that is the first manifestation of the ether, but you can also call it the ether, because infinite space is the totality of everything. It is infinite and it is rest, static. That is the ether. But as soon as you have movement, you have time, you have experience, now you have consciousness, you have thinking, thought energy. That's moving within space. Now you've already got a dynamic. That will condense into etheric energy, which is denser, but still moving in space. It's a real energy moving around in space. It is condensed space, pressure within space, moving in space. If that pressure condenses even more, we have light. Light we now know. Light is also physically manifest. We can see light. But light is still moving in space, propagating through space, the static ether. That's why light will still have a speed. It is the speed of this pressurized ether moving inside the static ether. But remember, the static ether has no physicality. But light energy is physical, has some manifestation, but it is still thought energy. It is still etheric energy. It is still spiritual energy. It is still consciousness. But condensed consciousness. Condensed consciousness moving through this background field of pure consciousness, space. That is why there's a speed of light. Now, if it condenses further, it becomes electricity. Electricity is even more dense ether. Condensed space moving inside static space. But these things are now relative. Electricity is relative to 2 points. It's a release of a pressure. And when you have, for example, a battery, there are 2 points, the anode and the cathode. Electricity is the release between those 2 points. It's relative. Relative pressurized ether inside the abstract, infinite, stationary ether that is space. But remember, space has no physical properties. But electricity is still the same consciousness energy as space. But it's more dense, it's thicker, more viscous, and it moves a bit slower than light, because it's still moving through space. Pure thought energy. That's why there's a speed of electricity. Then electricity will get denser. That will become plasma. Now, plasma is very dense ether. It moves slower. But it's still moving through space, which is thought energy. Space itself, the pure static infinite stationary ether, that is space. But plasma is condensed space moving, so it is time. But remember, that is also moving through space. It has a slight resistance, so plasma has a speed, and that is slower than electricity. And then finally, from a plasma, you have little bubbles of plasma which become atoms. Atoms now are material substance. Once you've got material substance, now you have kinetics, objects. And objects in space, again, move through space. Space has no physical properties, and an object will move through space. There is still a slight resistance. Physical objects move slower than plasma. Kinetics are slower. Now, of course, with technology, we can move faster in kinetics, but there are limitations to the speed of kinetics. It's slower than plasma, which is slower than electricity, which is slower than light, which is slower than etheric energy, which is slower than thought energy. Thought energy is the fastest. It is instantaneous because thought energy is space itself. For thought energy, there is no space. Thought energy is the creation of space. But remember, space is the ether, static, infinite. Inertia, it is rest, it is balance. But within that balance, we can create disturbances, a potential. And mostly we create little, limited potentials. There's little things going on, limited potential energies, and there's bigger things going on. For example, cosmological things, big energy going on. It's still a disturbance, a potential within space, within this unlimited, infinite ether. And of course, free energy means there is a way of tapping into that permanence. We have to create a static, permanent disturbance of the ether in order to get this energy out. Usually the potential is moving, so that potential will release, and then it's over. Energy is finished. If you can create a static, permanent potential in the ether, then this will manifest permanent energy, free energy, which I've talked about in the last lecture. So this gives you an idea of the levels of the ether, how it works. And all these movements happen within the static layer, the first manifestation of the ether, which is space. And all movement is now time happening in space. Different pressure, different density, movement happening within this range of manifestation. And you can have bubbles. You see, an atom is a bubble in plasma, very condensed space. Remember, plasma is condensed space, condensed ether. An atom is very condensed ether, very condensed space itself. Condensed space moving in space. But there is a crossover between space and matter, because space is not physical. Yeah, but it is spiritual. It is thought energy. This is what you've got to understand. Space is not physical, but we can experience it. It is here. It is thought energy. It is consciousness itself. Consciousness condenses into etheric energy. Still not really physical, but becoming physical. When etheric energy crosses over into light, now it's becoming so dense, heavy, essentially it is becoming objective. It is becoming fixed in space. The denser it becomes, the more fixed in space it becomes, until you've got an atom which is now permanently fixed in space. The other fluid can dissipate, spread out, disappear off to infinity. An atom is now locked, trapped in space. Now we have this difference between spirit and matter. It's still all just spirit, all just consciousness. But matter is condensed, trapped spirit. And you have different bubbles. So you also have a bubble of consciousness, a bubble of thought energy, a bubble of etheric energy that is a soul. And you have different bubbles. You can also have a bubble of light energy. This is a light body. Again, hard to understand. There's no science for this. The science comes from etheric energy. The etheric energy is not quite physical, but it is condensing into light. This is done by consciousness, not physical. Consciousness decides to condense. Remember, there is nothing will happen in the universe without consciousness. Consciousness is the only thing that can create a movement. Consciousness must decide to condense. So consciousness decides to condense into ether, which condenses into light. Light gets denser and denser until it becomes manifest. Once light is objective, we see it with these physical eyes, for example, or we can detect it physically. Now it's doing its own thing. Once you have objective reality, everyone must agree. But there's a crossover. The etheric body, etheric reality, there's still some variation, different levels of perception. I can have an etheric body, but you might perceive it differently. Someone else might perceive it differently. However, a light body, two people would perceive it the same. And if you had a very dense light, actually emitting light, everyone would see that the same. More dense becomes electricity. With electricity, you have magnetism, which I've talked about. But electricity is now more dense, condensed, that is objective. We all must agree on electricity. And the same with plasma and atoms. We now have objective reality. So to summarize again, the universe is one ether, one substance, infinite, total, balance, rest. It is static. But within that static ether, we have movement, disturbance. And we have the yin and the yang, two types of disturbance, expansion, contraction. And these two movements, these two spirals, condense and expand. And they interact together, and sometimes they interact and create a bubble, a balance, a frequency. And you have all different bubbles. Some bubbles are atoms. Some bubbles are souls, living beings. And these living beings, these souls, these bubbles of etheric energy, bubbles of thought energy, bubbles of light energy, these souls, these life forms, are creating the disturbance. There's nothing else that will create a disturbance in the ether except the soul. The pure infinite ether creates the soul, and the soul creates the disturbance. The unconscious mind wakes up. It wakes up, and now it creates a disturbance. That is the only disturbance that will happen. If you think about it, only animated life, only life moves anything in the universe. Now you could say there are autonomous processes going on, but all autonomous processes are entropic. Now again, besides the atom itself is perpetual, but you have movements of atoms, all things going on, and all these things are entropic. But you have life, you have consciousness, And that is not entropic. That is the opposite. That is neg-entropic, negative entropy. That is organisation. And only consciousness creates technology. Technology is the skill, the art of creating a disturbance in the ether. So all technology is a disturbance that we create. And we want to create a disturbance that gives us free energy. Permanent disturbance. Only consciousness can create technology. That is why consciousness is intrinsic. Not only does consciousness create the technology, but consciousness creates the atoms that are in the technology. It's all one and the same thing. Interaction between consciousness and the material world. But the material world is simply a condensed form of consciousness anyway. And it's all happening in the background static ether. And when we meditate, we can tune in to this stationary ether. It's stillness, it's balance, it's rest. It's the Zen meditation. It's the eye of the storm. And it's in a point, an infinitesimal point. It's in infinity, and it's in a point. That's where there is stillness. The spiral goes into a point, or it goes out to infinity. At the end, or at the beginning, there is rest. And that's what we call the 0 point, the point of inertia, and that's what we use in technology, again, to bring energy out of a point. But that is a soul. A soul is consciousness emerging from a point. It's the center of a bubble. So we create a bubble and we meditate on a point. Or we meditate on stillness, balance, harmony. There we tap into the background ether, the field, the energy, the life force, the chi, the prana. All manifestation comes from this infinite fluid, the ether. And we can get some when we meditate and tune into it. So I hope this made sense. And I hope this was a simple summary. And I hope you could visualize what I'm trying to say. This is difficult stuff to explain. Really, I'm trying to explain the unexplainable. So I'm always going to fail, but we always have to keep trying. I'm always going to keep trying. And I should get better and better. So just please bear with me. And please do like and subscribe, because I will only get better. I'm going to keep on trying. So thank you so much for your time listening to me. And if you haven't already, please do check out the whole of this lecture series. I explain it a bit more step by step. So thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in any of these other videos here.